Socrates. The only true wisdom consists in knowing that you know nothing. That's us, dude. Oh, yeah. Let's bag him. Yeah.
Socrates. Okay, so what's that knowledge of what's truly important called? I guess that would be wisdom, Socrates. Oh, to find happiness, you must have first cultivated wisdom. Tell me how you...
All we are is dust in the wind, dude. Dust. Wind. Dude.
How is Socrates within and without? How is he liminal? How is he monstrous?
So I have some I brought back some Jeopardy because it needed to happen. Mostly just because I had a little extra free time this week.
Are we doing 16 and 17? Is that what we're thinking? Or
yeah, so yeah, have you both watched 17? I guess I just kind of assumed we were, but
yeah.
I think so. That's still on Kierkegaard, and that's in Christ, right?
Yeah, it's Christ and the Logos. Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
I feel like I had a lot of thoughts about 16, but after 17, all my thoughts are about Hamlet and Seinfeld.
Good, perfect. So great. So my Jeopardy is a philosopher and Seinfeld Jeopardy. So either the answers are like Socrates, Kierkegaard, Jesus, or like George, Elaine, Jerry.
Okay.
So that's the playing field, the arena for you two agents to participate in. So first one, if you guys are ready to start, is what is a poet? An unhappy man who hides deep anguish in his heart, but whose lips are so formed that when the sigh and cry pass through them, it sounds like lovely music. And people flock around the poet and say, "Sing again soon." That is, may new sufferings torment your soul, but your lips be fashioned as before, for the cry would only frighten us, but the music that is blissful.
Who is George Costanza?
Ooh.
Joking.
Yeah, I like that. I had the presence of mind to realize your irony, Bruce. That was good, yeah. Any sincere guesses or?
And our options are Kierkegaard, Socrates, Jesus, and the cast of Seinfeld.
Roughly, yeah.
All right. Well, it doesn't sound like Jesus. I'm leaning Kierkegaard on that one.
I am too.
Yeah, it is Kierkegaard, yeah. All right. Number 2, answering the question, have you yearned? This person says, well, not recently. I crave all the time, constant craving, but I haven't yearned.
That sounds more like George Costanza.
Elaine or George? I'll go with George.
It is George, yeah. Do either of you have any history with Seinfeld?
I watched it a lot when I was a kid, and
Okay.
some of the memes stay with me. That sequence in which George decides to try to do the opposite of his instincts,
Yeah.
and then starts to feel that that's his religion, that informed some of my early thinking on what the essence of religion is.
I mean, that's Kierkegaard, right? Like he has this metanoetic view of himself where he self-transcends more through propositional logic, but the rest of it all is really very Vervaekian. Yeah. Bruce, you have any Seinfeld, spent any hours on Seinfeld?
Not that many, but I do remember the puffy shirt episode and the soup Nazi.
Oh, I almost brought a puffy shirt reference up. Oh, that's exciting to me. Yeah. The soft talker, it gets him to agree to wear the puffy shirt while she's speaking so lowly that he's embarrassed the whole time, and it becomes like a national meme by the end. Cool. All right. So very good. That was George, by the way. I would choose suffering over doing what's unjust.
Could be Kierkegaard, could be Socrates. I might lean Socrates.
I was thinking Kierkegaard.
Ooh, it is Socrates from the Gorgias or Gorgias.
Okay.
And I like that there's a sorting mechanism that immediately gets rid of half the options and then toys it down to like the last two that it's close. Yeah. Maybe the dingo ate your baby.
Elaine.
That's right. Yeah. Have you seen that one, Bruce?
I think so. Yeah.
Okay, good. Yeah. That was like for like a year and a half. That was like a cool thing you could say in public at appropriate times.
I do remember the dingo ate your baby thing. Yeah.
Yeah. Father, into the hands of you I commit the spirit of me.
Well, it's not Kramer. It's got to be Christ.
That's how often is that the choice? I'm leaning Jesus as well.
You're right, it is. Yeah, he even says pneuma, which I like because John talked about the pneuma quite a bit in his various talks in the last couple of months. So I like that Jesus is committing his pneuma to the Father. All right, the last one. Do you think it's effeminate for a man to put clothes in a gentle cycle?
It's obviously from Seinfeld. I don't remember it specifically. It could be any of them.
I'll go
I hope
with
it's George, though.
Okay, got George. Bruce, what are you gonna say?
I'll go with Seinfeld.
It was Jerry Seinfeld, yeah. I think it might have been one of those jokes
Beautiful.
at the beginning when they used to have that kind of minute of stand-up at the beginning. Anyways, very good. We got the pneuma, we got dingoes, the tragedy of poetry, and yeah, lots of good stuff. So very good.
I thought it was interesting how, I mean, John's trying to make a point by making that comparison of Seinfeldian irony to Kierkegaardian and Socratic irony, right? And it felt like Chris maybe wanted to push back a little by like specifying that it was hilarious. And I get the point John's trying to make, but I wondered myself whether or not the contrast was too extreme. Because when you deal with Kierkegaard's irony, you're having a relationship between the characters he's living into and this notion of Kierkegaard as that one. Now, if you watch Seinfeld and you just think it's a reality, of course, these are terrible people. You don't want them to be your friends. But when you watch it through the lens of Jerry Seinfeld and Larry David, as you should, right? You're watching through the writers, creators, and actors, then it has a very different feel. Then it's these people exploring a reality that they are critiquing and critics of that reality, which they are also critiquing. Because the final episode of Seinfeld shows them revealed in the prison they can never escape from, right?
Yeah.
So it's not, they're not being proposed as good citizens. They're being proposed as the failure of the critics of the failed society,
Right.
through the lens of those who stand outside of those creations. So I think maybe John could reach a richer appreciation of the show with time.
Yeah, I always think of like the kind of cynicism that David Foster Wallace has is like where you don't want to go in your nihilist cynicism. And when you have like The Office or Seinfeld, the wholesome sincerity that those shows do is the kind of sincerity Kierkegaard has as well. Like there's a lot of like realizing your own limitations in Seinfeld that I think isn't the kind of nihilist cynicism that John was pointing out as well, because I think there is a really like detached arrogance that they don't lack. They're kind of bumbling more than arrogant, I think, and that arrogance is what John dislikes.
Yeah, I was thinking of what was it? So it's a show about nothing, but what came up for me is a kind of Slavoj Žižek kind of a point, which is it matters which nothing it's nothing about. So there's this joke about 20th century communist states where a guy goes into a diner and asks for coffee without cream, and the waiter says, "I'm sorry, there's food shortages due to overly centralized top-down control systems. We don't have any cream. Could I bring you coffee without milk instead?" Right. So like there's a specificity to what's being neutralized. And I think it's important to realize that Seinfeld and a lot of the popular smart comedic demonstrations, which are maybe more like cynicism, but they're not neutralizing virtue and reality. They're neutralizing the conventional, the deficient conventional mode of society and the deficiency of the critiques of that mode.
I mean, that's what David Foster Wallace, I think, is trying to do too, right? Where he succumbs to his own kind of darkness in some sense. But what he's pointing to when he's saying, like, our lives are just like going to grocery stores over and over again. And the most exciting time in your life is like before you have to start working. Because once you start becoming like a productive member of society and a part of like a family, it's like the most boring commitment you could ever make to the world. And you lose your kind of sense of the heroic that I think the Greeks, you just feel it in Greek writing, because the world was still so treacherous and you were uncertain, that it just kind of breathed that way, that we've got so much certainty in the like the mundane cities we've built that it's almost depressing to participate in if you don't have a kind of an aspirational view of things. Or yeah, Bruce, I'm talking too much. What's alive for you, either in this episode or in what we're talking about?
There are some things that stood out to me I'd like to talk about, but just first, just responding to that in the boring domestic suburban kind of person. Isn't there a passage in Fear and Trembling where Kierkegaard is beholding the truly religious person, the person who's a knight of faith? And it's a very, very dull looking accountant type person or tax collecting type person, where he looks like he's nothing extraordinary, no hint of the infinite pouring through him. He's the guy who's excited about the new buses that are just beginning to appear in, Denmark. And, the philosophers are all decrying those buses, saying, oh my God, we're going to hell. What's becoming? And he's just like, oh, cool, a bus. And he rides it. But he's not standing out as an extraordinary religious figure. And that's what Kierkegaard was zeroing in on, especially in relationship to how he processed and digested Abraham, and, whether Abraham could be seen as just like a simpleton, an unquestioning believer, who the sophisticates would dismiss. But on the other side of that, he still looks like the simple person in a sense that the sophisticates would dismiss, but there's something there.
Before Enlightenment, get excited about new buses. After Enlightenment, get excited about new buses.
Exactly. Well, one of the things.
Well, that sounds like part of. Oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead. Sorry. Yeah.
I was just going to say that seems central to a lot of Kierkegaard's concerns about like who is a Christian, right? And then we can do this more dramatic version of like there's the illuminated being who's so illuminated they go beyond their illumination and they're the ordinary being again. But we don't have to go that far. We can just look at this discussion that's alive in Kierkegaard's mind between people who identify with and present themselves as Christians and those who are living in the mode of Christ. And what does it mean that those are two very different groups of people? Right? What is your religion? What is the religion? If it's a real religion, it should be functional, even if you and other people don't recognize it as religion. Like that's not the criteria. That it strikes other people as religious can't be the criteria.
Paul Tillich talks about quasi-religion, which I really like. He talks about pseudo-religion and quasi-religion. And pseudo-religion is like what you're saying, Layman. It espouses to do religious functioning and to be religious, but it fails. Like Nazism could be like pseudo-culture or something like that. And then there's quasi-religion, so it doesn't have to espouse that it's trying to be religious, but it creates religious functioning. And so like John's religion of no religion strikes me as quasi-religious, because what it ends up doing is providing a lot of meaning, hopefully homing people, orienting, doing all these kind of things that you would hope a religion does. But John is like, I don't buy into anything supernatural. And so if you want to put the word religion on me, let's get out of here. Like, I'm not interested. So that quasi, and then, yeah, like the idea of like, should you look like a believer. What does it say in like the New and Old Testament, right? Like the people that are the most holy looking are often like the last to get seated at like the table of God. Yeah.
Yeah, that was one thing that was that that contrast that Layman was just mentioning. I'm thinking about the parable of the two sons. It's not exactly a match, but the parable of the two sons. One, God, the father asks them to do something. He says, no, but I don't want any of that. But he goes out and actually does what needs to be done. And then the one who says, yes, I will, and is the obedient one, but actually lives in a way that's not fulfilling the father's wishes, or actually spends the day in a way that's not fulfilling the father's wishes. And so that's the same kind of, I think, contrast. And that's one of the things that was coming up for me was around the paradoxical structure of Jesus's parables. And I have a friend who went pretty deeply into that, trying to develop a post-metaphysical Christian theology around the core paradoxical structure underneath all of Jesus's parables, but really wanting to argue that the parables of Jesus are really different from any other parables of that time in their structure. They have a unique structure, and the figure of Christ, he's arguing, is unique in the way that Christ interrupts meaning making and expectation and reverses roles. So that kind of structure seems to be what Kierkegaard is also playing with in general, especially in that navigation between the ethical and the religious phase.
Yeah, I'm thinking of a passage in the gospel where the disciples are responding to Jewish public prayer, and they ask Jesus how to pray, and he says, pray to your Father in secret. Right. And you could expand that out and go, if you were a real Christian, nobody would know it. Otherwise, you're not really a Christian.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's like, those are the coolest messages of Jesus, right? Like, love thy neighbor is clearly everywhere in the New Testament, but then also like, don't be a hypocrite is everywhere. Like the imagery of snakes and different ways that they kind of highlight, hey, right here there's a hypocrite, and you should pay attention to the kind of hypocrisy that is being confronted by Christ or his disciples. And it really it almost, yeah, it's the same way Socrates does the same thing intellectually, but they do it more ethically and metaphysically, or something like ontologically. Christ confronts you in such a paradoxical way of being all these antinomies together, glued together by the absolute. Like, that's the genius. If it was just a bunch of antinomies, it'd be Seinfeld. But because it's glued together by both prophecy and like a direct claim on being the absolute, it all of a sudden goes like, oh, you're not worthless. Like, a Roman would call you worthless, but a Jew wouldn't. Like, what's happening here? And the paradoxicality, which is like what Tanabe, who comes up a lot in this episode, says just as part of life. Like, life is paradoxical. Like, I think a lot of the Kyoto school are always saying, like, look, John says this too, like, reason doesn't become critical of itself, or it has nowhere to stand. It has these two flaws of either being so circular it has nowhere to stand, or so circular it has no self-criticality, that then creates the humility of like other power, or of like the finite and the infinite kind of interpenetrating each other, to use some of John's language.
I have some thoughts about that part, but I want to come back a little bit to the presentation and the reality of religion in Kierkegaard and in Jesus, because there's a way for me that Kierkegaard approaches the koan form. So I often think of the intersections of Zen and Christianity when I'm reading Kierkegaard. And in koans, many of them take the form of a dialogue between an adept and somebody who's developing. But in Dogen's writings, he makes it very explicit that there is no generator and recipient. There's no master and acolyte relationship. Each point in a koan is the absolute resolution of the koan, and you have to read it that way. Otherwise, you're letting yourself off the hook for the pressure that it can provide. So when I look at Kierkegaard and there's a critique of Christendom. Christendom does not consist of people who are really doing what Christ wanted us to do. When I first encountered him, I thought, oh yeah, that's a real critique. It's these people are not doing anything at all. They say they're Christians, but they're not doing anything like Christ. They are in no sense Christians. But now I think of it more in that Dogen sense, like that both positions have this complete validity to them. Because the other side of it is a religion fundamentally is a level of coherence that becomes sacred that we generate in a cultural field. That to be Christian is to be a participant in Christendom, not to do anything that you read about in a book that some other guy supposedly did, right? To be actually faithful is to be a faithful member of the civic spirit of the people you belong to. It's fundamentally a cultural phenomenon. Right. So now I have both of those that I have to play with. Whereas when I first encountered Kierkegaard, I got to think, he's right, and those people are fools.
I think it's the either side of the bell curve thing again. Cool to ride the bus, it's like, the boring suburban dad bod believers are the ultimate.
We say more about that, Bruce? That seems too provocative to be left in the mystery that you left it in.
I'm just trying to elevate myself.
Yeah, it sounded awfully convenient there.
Didn't it?
Well, Tanabe does the same thing in philosophy of metanoetics, that he's constantly comparing himself to saints and saying, like, part of why I have to enact a philosophy of metanoetics is because I'm a nothing. Like, I can't be a saint. Like, woe is me, I wish I could be a saint. Like these Europeans who claim to like understand pure spirit and pure reason and all of this transcendence. And he goes, oh, well, it sucks because I'm a failure of a living person and I can't transcend. So the paradoxicality of like,
right,
how does George receive salvation or whatever?
But that confession from Tanabe, right? That's the hint that he is a saint.
Yes, that came up.
That's
in
where the irony
lot,
comes in. Is the irony comes close to comedy, and I think Seinfeld does this really well because Larry and Jerry were committed to maintaining the comic form and not modifying it for other concerns. And in the comic form, you always end up taking on the negative identity at the end, right? You go into it. You can't resolve it. You can't achieve an aspirational solution. You have to end on identifying yourself publicly as the negative. I don't know if you guys ever saw the Marx Brothers movie Animal Crackers. There's this scene where Groucho proposes marriage to two women at the same time. And they accuse him of bigamy, and he's like, of course it's bigamy. It's big of all of us. Let's be big for a change. We'll run away and get married. You two are perfect. I wouldn't let any other women in on this. Well, maybe one or two, but no men. In fact, I might not go myself. Right? He writes himself out at the end. That's why it's the comic form of irony is you have to say, hey, unfortunately, I'm the inept one. I'm the failure. I'm the void. But that's the sign that someone's doing it in the language of the ironic.
One thing I was thinking about also with this is Thomas Merton. Thomas Merton really went through a period a couple times in his life where he really picked up Kierkegaard and found a lot of nourishment in Kierkegaard. And he kind of jokes a little bit in one of his journals, I think, where he's talking about he doesn't really like to read Kierkegaard on retreat because something about Kierkegaard's voice comes across as the strident voice of a retreat master harassing you and oh God, and he says it gets him too stirred up, but at the same time, he really, it actually spoke to him a great deal, and he saw in the way that Abraham silently went out just to carry out the paradoxical thing that God had asked of him, that I'm going to make you progenitor of an abundant generations and go out and kill your only, and he silently went out and did that, and he bore that silently. And there's really only the focus in that parable, or in that story, on the deed, on the doing of that. And there's not a lot of internal dialogue or wrestling, or what does God want, or where's my wiggle room, or any of that. There's that. So in that, he also sees that Mary was like that too. Mary was asked an impossible thing, and she didn't spend a lot of time talking about that, or wrestling with that, or turning it into a theology. She went through that. And so he felt there's something in there, that there's something that you can't say, except maybe in ironic or funny form, but you can't speak it into the public space. And it's better to enact it in silence. And so for him, that's really what he wrestled with, and what became part of his ability to go through the rigors of the early formation of the Trappist kind of process, where he was, as a rebellious college student, really struggling with some of that structure, and the bellowing retreat master and all of that.
Yeah, that's the other side of how irony is often presented in these dialogues we're listening to, because I think there's a way in which it's frequently touched upon as the encounter with the imperfect access to the absolute, which reveals that the partial inheres in the absolute but can never give you the absolute. Right? So you're encountering a world which is insufficient, but its insufficiency is sustained by the sufficient. But the other side of that is in you, where you have something that you do not say in all of your sayings.
Right.
Well, and that's what makes Christ more mythological than philosophical, is that it's this inactive virtue, rather than like a purely intellectually transcended kind of meta-noetic contemplation, and the Platonic Socratic contemplative tradition versus the more inactive kind of Christian tradition. I think that's why John even says I like Christian Neoplatonists, because they do merge the inactive part. Because when I read like the Phaedrus or something like that, I can go oh, they have a vision of illuminated, numinous, go up, 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 but it's it doesn't come back down easily. The come back down is well, because you were loved by the good, you should then love the world, or something like that, which makes a lot of sense, also, but isn't quite as logical as oh, well, you've already contemplated it, why do more, or something like that. But because I think that's one of the weaknesses, that we just don't have all of the people that really wrote about Socrates other than Plato and a few other sources. And Plato spins him into this very articulated kind of creature or being, in a way that Christ is so much more symbolic and participatory in ridiculous ways. I think Socrates is more plausible, but Christ is more powerful in some sense, as a symbol, maybe.
What they have in common is that they both lean into this place of unbearable friction.
Yeah.
Right? It's you can read Socrates as being an ascensionist, when there's some truth to that in the portrayal from Plato, certainly, but he also goes voluntarily to the court, to his death, to his relationship with Xanthippe, right? He doesn't move away from that friction point. And that friction point in the Christ story is embodied symbolically, right? It's the ultimate ascension, and yet it's not only in a particular human body, but we fucking nailed that body to this junction point, right? There's no escaping. But they both lean into the point from which there is no escape.
Yeah, the relational aspect of them to life allows them both to become these awesome symbols for like the ground of being, like the ground and ceiling. I think in episode 16, John says like the ground and ceiling. I'm like, oh, that's cool. Like not only is it the ground, but it's also like keeping things contained as well. And yeah, um the acts of them, yeah, I like what we're saying here. I don't want to say more. Yeah, go, Bruce, did you want to add to that?
I think it's interesting that there's that John is befriended by and so close with Christopher, and that there's this Socrates Kierkegaard encounter and wrestling. It's not only a fusion or an integration or a synthesis or something like that. There's a tension point, and I think it's really interesting, because I think it's in Fear and Trembling where Kierkegaard is pretty much lambasting Hegel and pretty much lambasting anybody who thinks that they have a system of all systems, who has the big narrative that's going to capture it all, who's going to be the systematizer, who has a theory about reality. So, of course, for Layman and I with integral or big picture metamodernism, I mean, that's also a reminder of like, what are you after with that? But it's also for synoptic integration of Zen Platonism, which could become this big thing, So I'm really appreciating this meeting point right here, and that, yeah, that's what I wanted to say with that first.
Well, it puts me in mind of two things. One is my last Substack article was about intentional suffering, which played a role in me healing my back injury. But also I included some links to John and Chris's talks on this subject, because there's a discussion in Gurdjieff that's very pertinent about voluntary versus intentional suffering. And the voluntary suffering is the suffering you agree to bear for some reason. And you could say that that's at the heart of the ethical stage or mode, right? So the aesthetic person doesn't want their suffering and wants to take advantage of all their options. Don't dream it, be it, it says at the end of Rocky Horror Picture Show. That's the perfect aesthetic, as Dr. Frankenfurter. And the ethical person says, well, actually, you can't, right? There's a lot of your possibilities you can't get without canceling other possibilities. And there's a lot of pleasures you can't have without suffering. So you're going to have to agree to undergo suffering and limit your possibilities in order to have worthwhile pleasures. So that's, let's say, voluntary suffering. But then there's this other kind associated with the more religious, right? When does suffering become a transfiguration? It's when you're actively reaching out for it, when the kernel of the suffering itself is the thing that you think has the transmutational value. You're not putting up with it to get something else. It's the very thing itself that you think has that capacity. Now I forget how that related to the previous point. The other thing I wanted to say was about systems and Hegel, and yes, anybody who's got systems and thinks their system is relatively consistent has a bit of a problem, right? That they don't know how to incorporate the inconsistent, and the inconsistent somehow sustains the consistency in the way that maybe might have been Lacan, but like a fetish is the thing that allows a person to be reasonable the rest of the time. There's some basic irrationality or inconsistency upon which a consistent system is based. And if you can't experience that and not include it nominally in the system, but undergo the experience of the contradiction and the irrationality, then you can't really have fluid relational access to that consistency.
I mean, that's why Christ is so great, right? Because he confronts you at every turn. As loving as all of those stories are, they're constantly reaffirming, they're negating and affirming and negating and affirming and negating and affirming. And like it creates this internal conflict that a lot of people can't bear. which is kind of like the metanoetic move, right? Because once you realize your finitude and then you open up to other power, then you die and are reborn to possibility. When you cling to your ego, to your self-power, you're frozen. And like you said, like maybe you need some suffering. A lot of I think Christ is perfect for being that kind of confronting other, as Christopher was kind of saying at the end, that like he just is this symbol that because you can relate to it, it allows you to self transform through the symbol, regardless of its historical legitimacy, even.
Quality of that relationship seems really at stake to me. Like there's the icon of the non-rational identity, all right, and you go, okay, maybe we can acknowledge that that has to play a role in the system, but that's not adequate. That's not adequate relating to it. It's something more like devotion. It's something more like an existential committedness to that thing, which allows it to begin to function as both the sustainer of the consistency of your reason and as a portal beyond irony into the transcendent. But if you don't establish that relation, then the irony is not a portal. It's just an advanced abstract circulation of ideas.
I agree. I think that devotional aspect is huge. That's why it's so easy. Like if you really just devote yourself to something and let go, like in a flow state sense, kind of let go of your ego and just try to expand in that domain that you're in, then you can self-transcend in such a different way that the interaction, the conscious tension of it really is where a lot of the value is. Like if you have a relationship and you let it become unconscious, you can kind of never fix it. But by consciously engaging in like all the suffering, then you can have this epiphany that throws you back into like right relation with the truth that is like agonizingly beautiful or something like that. And John and Chris, they also talk about how it's not just like extending yourself. That's why like real transformation can't just be like Rob likes cookies, get more cookies. And like, oh, I've self-transformed. I have 10 cookies instead of 5. Watch me go. It has to be something of like more meaningful that challenges your kind of normativity in a way that destroys the normativity to let it be replaced.
There's something, don't know if I'm going to try to finagle a connection here. We'll see if it works. But I heard a story about Krishnamurti the other day that is a unpublished story. It's a inside story. It's not in any books, but there was a lady who worked with him very closely for about 59 years. And she was, at one of his schools, and she attended to him, and she did all kinds of things with him for most of her life. And when they were both elderly, she looked at him and she said, I'm a failure, or this relationship is a failure, or the teaching is a failure. I've been with you closer than most people, and after all this time, I haven't transformed. What's wrong? What's missing? And of course, there are people who have criticisms of him, he doesn't have a very good teaching method to actually afford transformation for people. But one of the things that he said, which was interesting, because almost the whole length of his teaching, he decried the imagination and he decried idealization as unnecessary things. And his answer to her about why haven't I transformed and what do I need to do? He said, you haven't transformed because you aren't me. You need to be me. And then she says, how can I do that? How can I be you? I'm me. He said, use your imagination. And so he basically undercut all of his teachings in those 2 little instructions. And yet it seems to be that he's asking for that leap across the divide that you've got to utterly, in one way, let go of the normativity that's been your whole life, including your relationship to this other.
Evan Thompson has a similar story. He has this awesome, like it's like an hour on YouTube on hope, and he's like famously not a Buddhist, so but he has like more meditation experience than most people on earth. So there's this irony, and he's talking about hope, and you get so trapped in your desires that you can kind of, it has to almost be a leap of faith, is the way he's talking about this hope, because the story he shares is like this woman lost her child, she goes to the Buddha sends her everywhere to find someone who's never lost something, and then like get a piece of mustard from their house or some ridiculous thing. So she does that, she can't find anybody, she has this metanoetic moment of like, oh, my suffering is a part of my humanity, it's not a personal torture or whatever. And then she joins the Sangha and moves forward. And he makes the point when he's retelling the story that like you have to kind of buy in. You have to have this leap of faith to think that's true, because there's another version of that story where she never makes that insight. She just feels the grief, and the Buddha fails because the grief was real and stuff like that. So it's very yeah, that there is a bit of kind of again, I like the idea of other power. We brought this up a couple of times, Bruce, where I always get excited that you get excited about Jiriki and Tariki, because it's not a rationalist point of view. The other power is almost anti-rationalist from within rationalism. And I found it so powerful as a practice to just say, like, symbolically, I'm worthless, or symbolically, Westernism is worthless, and just kind of have that humility. And then all of a sudden you don't become a nihilist, you get like some new insight into like, oh well, that's good, you made that a admittance, and now you can finally move forward and be kind of unfrozen, which these rationalist kind of dialogue, oh, we'll dialogue our way out of hell or whatever, and it's like, well, maybe that's impossible, maybe you actually have to have humility to get out of hell, and not faith in reason. And I don't know, like, I have some other friends, we talk a lot about Alexander Bard, and he's a good contrapoint to kind of John, because John's super logos, and Alexander Bard's kind of like pathos and ethos, and he gets a lot wilder in his spirituality. So I think it's kind of fun to contrast this faith and aspiration and just trust in the logos versus some of these other kind of points of view.
I appreciate the odd situation that Krishnamurti was in, of occupying the guru function without being willing to teach people the traditional dynamics of the guru function, and in the end having to suggest some of those dynamics.
Yep.
So there's that. There's also this sense of the wild gap between the self and the self that is transformed, and that it's not, as Adi Das said, you can't get there from here. But there's also something interesting around that woman going to Krishnamurti and wanting a solution to the suffering of that, rather than being interested in that suffering. Right. And this gets to the Alexander Bard point in a way, right? That the intentional suffering, the Gurdjieffian suffering, is you're actually interested in the pathos itself, in that of it. That's where the transformation is concealed, not in what strategy do I apply and how can I be good in order to avoid that thing. That thing is a portal if approached correctly, but it's really the pathos underlies the logos in terms of the logos transforming itself.
Yeah, which is kind of what James Hillman and says as well, that you have to sit with the pathos more in the process. And again, like, I think Jesus does that really well. He lets you sit with the pathos and the logos and all the paradoxicality through his figure, and kind of what you're saying. If you do sit through that Christian suffering, then you can go, oh, life's so easy now. Like, I see it so much more clearly through the pattern of Christ, not because I intellectually grokked it, but because I existentially encountered it and survived it, much more like Job. Then, yeah.
I want to do what John did and give a shout out to Chris's formulation that Kierkegaard is looking for Christ with the eye of Socrates. That was pretty sweet formulation. I'm also curious what you two gentlemen would say to the question, why doesn't Socrates become Hamlet?
Socrates is much less reflective than people give him credit for. Like the dialogues are very abstruse and technical and thoughtful, and the average Greek had a kind of education that we just don't have today that kind of, I think, they make them seem more cognitively intimidating to us than they probably were in their milieu. But the yeah, I don't think of Socrates as a pontificator. That's I think where Hamlet is unique, because Hamlet's always reflective and kind of always got a synoptic, like a omnipotent view of things, and he can see the big picture so clearly. But Socrates, only because I think he debates such people, engages them in that way. I think he'd be much more happy being like enacting virtue than debating the like relativist skeptics of his day. Um,
What about you, Bruce?
I don't know. I don't know if I have a good answer for that. For me, uh, there seems to be about Hamlet more of the sense of the person who is uh, the knight of infinite resignation, in a sense, in what Kierkegaard was talking about, the the one who somehow delights in the twisting in on the self, but in a way that that is that it's like a hangnail that keeps pushing into itself just to irritate, and somehow he finds his reality in that irritation. And I don't see Socrates as that kind of person where well, I think what you were saying with the reflection, but that he's not turning in on himself in order just to find him, to experience the anguish that proves his identity. So I don't know, just a characterological thing. I don't know. Well, yeah, there's something else I was thinking, but it would be a leap to go there for right now. I wanted to say something else about Barge, but
Well, now I'm curious. That's I agree. There's a narcissism in Hamlet. There's a forgetting of the other in everything he does, which is problematic, right? I don't see that in Socrates. He's very open to the other. And I think Robert's point is fascinating too, that it's a folksier, earthier way of being in ancient Greece. It doesn't have the flavor of the modernist intellectual that Hamlet has.
well, and Socrates is erotic. Like he's a sensuous living. He would drink everyone under the table, and he would fight in wars, and he would go to be a politician when his little straw got drawn. Where Hamlet is constantly removing himself from the situation somehow psychologically. He's always pulling himself one more degree of freedom away from reality so that he can further take like a higher view on what's unfolding. Um,
What I hear in both of those is it's the absence of things outside of Hamlet's reasoning that's problematic, right? It's a fun game to look into his logic for an error. But maybe what Shakespeare is saying is that's what he's doing. He's looking into his logic for an error, and it's not located in his logic. It's located in other people. It's located in the polis. It's located in the body. It's located in, I mean, Socrates has these other advantages, right? He was trained by Diotima. He has a support system, an esoteric sect that could detect that he's the kind of person he is, that he's got ironic tendencies and cultivate them into something virtuous. Hamlet is maybe, um, like a liminal character trapped in a world that has no recognition or support for that. As a result, he has no peer group, he has no elders, He has no one to help him establish those other things you need in order to be able to make use of a cognition that can go right to irony. And without those other things, all he's doing is running up and down the cognitive stack, getting nowhere.
Yeah, because I mean, if you just look in the Greek, the dialogues, they talk about friendship and love, and it's a much more passionate than Hamlet's. They visit a graveyard, they visit some procedural kind of royalty event. It's all very detached, and I think if we had more sources of Socrates, we would see him even more striking and calling on us to be more virtuous. I think it was all destroyed by mostly Christians in Rome. Um, so we're just, at a loss
There's
for
an
that.
aggression thing there too. Like Socrates was a soldier, whereas Hamlet has like an aggression integration problem related to his dad and the absence of his dad somehow, right? Like Hamlet can either be without aggression or manifest useless aggression. These are his two options, right? And neither of them represent the ability to integrate that particular energy, which is an energy that's expected of a healthy prince, but where there's some kind of distortion in his lineage that goes back to paternal trauma or something like that. But that's just one of the many embodied things that he's lacking. And if he had those things, then his ability to access this very refined, abstract, meta, and ironic consciousness could have been religiously transformative, right? The problem is not that he can do that thing. The problem is that he lacks the other things that would make that thing a lived reality.
Yeah, it's the dynamic system of a soul that he lacks parts of. I mean, even like in the Platonic view, I think it can get too contemplative if you start to like really alienate desire and thumos as evil. If you say like, oh, those are actually meant to be dominated, yet you see there's a lot of jocular, celebratory, like the actual Platonists are not as inhibited as the kind of British viewed the Platonists maybe in 150 years ago. So I think again, like the if you were meeting in a grove with all these statues of muses and you were down at the market and at the battlefield and at the like Socrates is also going everywhere. Plato is or I mean Hamlet is not a very active like liver. He's not a vital kind of liver of life the way again I think Socrates is quite erotic, and that erotic John used to say this a lot. I haven't actually heard him say it a lot, but like when your kind of intellect and your sexuality interpenetrate, there's like this super abundance of both that you have the eroticness to kind of like go into life as deeply as you want, and also the intellect to kind of go as wide as you can. And when they kind of interpenetrate really well, that's good. But when you just have one or the other, you're a impulsive wanton caught up in the sensory world, or a detached speculator unable to actually impact.
Speaking of over intellectual, over erotic weirdos, what were you going to say about Bard, Bruce?
Yeah.
There are a couple things. So one, this is related, I think, but in listening to John ask Christopher about Kierkegaard's decision with regard to getting married or not, right? With Regina, and his decision not to do it. And then writing to her later to say, now we can be consummated in a real kind of love. I don't know if I'm not recalling Fear and Loathing book well enough to remember all of the details, and I didn't pick this up in the conversation. I heard in Christopher's explanation of that a discussion of that this was that Kierkegaard needed to do this in order to enact the religious life. But part of the definition of somebody who is the knight of infinite resignation is the person who says, I can't have that love I will resolve myself to the not having of the love, and in the not having, I will try to cultivate a kind of intimacy, right? But it's through that resignation of the inability to have, right? Whereas the Knight of Faith, they just hold the paradox of the impossibility, and they just go forward, right? So I don't know how Christopher was framing it. It seems to me, and I might be wrong, I'm definitely no Kierkegaard scholar. It seems to me he made more of the Knight of Infinite Resignation move than the Knight of Faith move with regard to Regina. So that was part of the context for why I started thinking about some of the stuff that ultimately touched on Bard, where I was thinking of his notion of the Bard absolute. And his notion of the Bard absolute is that there are certain teachings that aren't meant for the ethical stage. They aren't meant for, conventional society. And if you put them out there too soon, they don't, it messes things up. It's destructive, right? And I was thinking about this holding of the paradox and the disruption of meaning and the reversals and the certain kind of irony and all of that. And I think the larger picture of like big systems of thought, right? I don't know if there's too many threads I'm trying to put together here, but I hope they'll all hang. In the larger systems of thought, if we try to create a larger system of thought that folds into it this parabolic, paradoxical, ironic thing, there's almost a concern that it can't work at the big scale, right? That we're going to destroy it. There's a saying in Tibet where, if you've got a saddle on a horse that is becoming stiff, you can cover it with butter and loosen it up, right? And the butter is the very precious stuff. But if you cured the saddle in the butter initially, and then it gets stiff, adding more butter will never loosen it, will never make it pliable or flexible again. So there's this sense of that, of the necessity of a Bard absolute, that if we tried to build this system that folds in some of that paradoxical, disruptive Jesus component, we inoculate ourselves against the power of that. Do you know what I'm saying? Not sure if I did a good job bringing all those things together.
Yeah, it's there's a danger of it being too clean when we think the way Bard communicates about the tantric as opposed to the sutric dimension of things. And there's something about the troubling nature of the ambiguity and how you're exposed to that, which is especially useful over time, at least to the ironic, liminal, shamanic characters in the village, but maybe for everyone as well as they start to move into post-conventional stages, right? So there's some kind of sweet spot there, because I think it is true that it's disruptive to have access. For different types of people, it's disruptive at different moments to have access to things too early. But the solution is not no access, right? Mm-hmm. It's the appropriate amount of disturbance. Also, you said fear and loathing when I think you meant fear and trembling, and it gave me this image of like Kierkegaard.
Did I say that?
One of those fear, yeah. So then I'm like, fear and trembling in Las Vegas is what I'm thinking now. Kierkegaard on the road. But I thought that's what Thompson was doing, though. He was living out through characters as well.
Man,
and the ethical and the aesthetic were.
You could do, what is it, Ralph Steadman, or the guy who did those paintings? Like, you just have Kierkegaard in the car with Hunter S. Thompson. Fear
I'm
and
going to do
trembling in
that.
Las Vegas.
That's my mission for mid-journey tonight.
Yeah, as soon as the AI gets a little better, we can create that hour-long movie. Yeah.
So one of the things I wanted to say there in that setup I did with Kierkegaard and the Night of Resignation, Night of Faith, they're not directly related, but I was thinking about that pivot point, between the conventional life, even the religiously self-justified conventional life that thinks it's standing apart, but it's actually not. It hasn't taken that leap, right? And then the nature of that leap. And there needs to be something genuinely disruptive, but there's also needing to be something that's actually not that's not folded into the rationalized structure of the common religion. That there needs to be something that, because I don't know if I can make it more clear than that. I'm thinking about his impulse too at the end of his life to withdraw from society, and Merton is also following that there's this need to, in some sense, step outside, and then you can come in appropriately disturbing manners from the outskirts.
Well, I'm wondering about that. Chris's recounting of that final message to Regina, or I want to say Regina, because there's something there which, on the one hand, is maybe his recognition that he was too much the Night of Infinite Resignation and not enough the Night of Faith, and he's trying to reach out and amend that. But there's also a sense in which now, feeling like he's actually on the outside, he can reach in with a subtler provocation, as if it's a benevolent gesture, which perhaps it is.
Do you think he could suffer from being too pure and like psyching himself out from love as well? Like he's so philosophical and so intense that it gives him almost this opportunity to self-justify his cold feet or whatever. I mean, I don't know. I'm not like a historical scholar. I'm sure there are people on Earth that have studied to death this relationship, but it feels so noble and so virtuous what he's doing. But it could also just be like human frailty and nervousness of like, you psych yourself out into how glorious being is and how non-glorious you are, or something like that. It's
I think that's my overall impression of what we read in Kierkegaard is an extremely successful example of a neurotic white nerd who constantly fails at his engagements, but then constantly succeeds at turning that failure into something productive so that he's making progress.
Yeah, sure. He's transmuting into this like the material into like the numinous over and over and over again. But it's like that woman carries the numinous too. Like you don't have to worry so much about leaving the divine. I don't know. It's just interesting.
Right. But then we don't know. There's so much we just don't know, right? Like you're in that relationship. We go, this is a perfectly fine relationship for Copenhagen at this time, but maybe it doesn't really satisfy him, right? And he's like, this is actually never going to be an authentic relationship. It's never going to have the eros I actually want in it. It's going to fit all of the things, but I'm going to make a gesture for existential authenticity and say no, even though it satisfies a lot of the things I'm after.
I mean, could you imagine like falling in love with some nun that just gave all of her care to Christ, and you're just in this perpetual love triangle with transcendence essentially as one of the three parts of the triangle where you're kind of stuck. Yeah, I like that's why they brought up Schindler very briefly a couple of times, but I like how DC Schindler kind of tries to save the appearance and saying that like there's three levels of virtues. There's the completely relative, then there's kind of like the completely transcendent, and then there's like the practical transcendent that's both transcendent and relative. And Socrates claims that's like the greatest version of justice, or whatever the good that they're talking about. And it's like his transcendent kind of function there never transcended the transcendence back into the eminent to maybe keep the relationship together. Again, like it's all him, whatever he wanted to do. Maybe she had horrible breath. She could have had, she's kind of short on one, her right foot was shorter than her left. We don't really know deeply the details.
That's a deal breaker.
Yeah, you're not aesthetically pleasing enough. It had nothing to do with the ethical, but I need to honor both the aesthetic and the ethical, and you only do one of the two. So, yeah.
I just feel like I want to go back. I'm just curious. I want to go back and dig a little bit, not too much. I'm not a big aficionado or have much historical interest, but I feel like something's fishy there. I smell something, and that's okay. It's totally okay for that to actually be the case, and maybe he transmuted it, but I smell some justification in what he was doing with that, and some rationalized inflation.
Yeah, that'll be the risk there. Like when I mean, that's my take on him, right? The white nerd transmuting his failures, but they are failures.
Mhm.
They didn't have to be failures. They could have been successful events of contact with others, with the world, with all kinds of things, which they might have been had he had supports, right? Like Hamlet, where was the support? Socrates has supports. Some people, Diotima finds him young and cultivates these things. There's a community of pro-sage circumstances going on there, right? So Kierkegaard, like Hamlet, lacks a lot of the things that you would need in order to be able to bring that into contact with the world. And so he suffers his neurotic recoil. But then the reason he's interesting to us is that he successfully makes something really good out of his neurotic recoil. Now, of course, he's bullshitting himself to some degree. It's not always purely successful, but given the number of people who are in neurotic recoil from relationships in the world, this is an extraordinary response to that.
Yeah. Yeah.
The other thing that came up for me was when they were going through, John did a little falsetto voice at one point, trying to illustrate what he meant by something that might get mistaken for irony. It was kind of like a woman at a party who wasn't concerned about the fact that she was making inconsistent and contradictory statements. And the fact that it was kind of a woman in the scenario, given John's vocal tone, made me think of an important thing that has to be teased apart. Because, of course, there are people who are insensitive or indifferent or uninterested in the inconsistencies of their position. They're misologists of various kinds. Okay. But then there's also this archetypally more feminine style of processing these things that moves in a more elaborate circle, that doesn't at each step say, hey, here's the irony, but just takes one of the positions, takes the next position, takes the next position, drops it, is not interested in the fact that the previous position is contradictory to this one, but is processing not in that moment, but through the whole cycle. And at the end of the cycle of all the partial positions, has come up with a depth of understanding. So there's these two different modes, right? I run into this in relationships all the time, which is I kind of want the whole irony to be nicely packaged and summed up at each step. That makes me feel very secure. And I have to exert some effort to listen to someone who's going through these various partial positions to get to something, because I don't know if they're going to get to something or not. I have to learn that about them over time. But there is this other classically yin mode of cycling through it that we don't want to get confused with the person who is merely indifferent to inconsistency.
That's again the hyper rationalism is showing up as well, right? Because that kind of unconscious transcendence through like a kind of sincerity to each individual ironic thing that ends up having epiphanies and ends up self-transcending. Yeah, it's very different than this very purposeful, logical, kind of piece by piece, almost stepwise transformation in people. Yeah, I don't know. It was kind of funny watching John get almost upset. He kept saying like there was Christopher was like, "Do you mean lazy? Are people lazy thinkers? Is that one of the three?" And John's like, "Yeah, those lazy thinkers." Like he was like almost like one of his students kept like turning in a
It sounded
paper
very
3 days
personal,
late.
like he was at a party where somebody said that.
Right.
And now he gets to talk about it.
Yeah. Like his son is actually that character. He keeps picturing like his son leaving macaroni and cheese over burning on the stove. And he's like, if only more rationality was hypothetically in the kitchen, then then the world would be better. Yeah, there could have been some projection there. I mean, I get John's point because John's trying to address the culture and the especially in like the early 2000s, right? Like that was the peak of like hipster irony where drinking cheap beer was elitist and stuff like that. And it's this kind of superficial living where you're mocking what is real to kind of disassociate from its tragic element or something like that.
Right. But are you? So, like, this is a tie-in because I learned about Slavoj Žižek in a book called Seinfeld and Philosophy that a friend of mine had when I was a kid. And in that book, Žižek is quoted as making a distinction between irony and cynicism, and that it's easy to get those mixed up. In integral theory, we'd call that a pre-trans fallacy, right? They're both being standoffish against the convention. They both think they're doing it in the sophisticated way, but one is doing it because they have an allegiance to a more primitive other thing, and one is doing it because they're actually capable of inhabiting that simultaneous moment of affirming something and being disidentified from it. So we don't know in any given case, like the pluralistic emergence from with culture, from within culture, so to speak, is not necessarily what we think it of. It may be that most of the people who exhibit or even claim that kind of response are not actually capable of doing what they're talking about. They may just be primitively withdrawn from the mode of the culture and identified with some other more primitive drives. It may be pre-modern rather than postmodern. It may be pre-conventional rather than ironic, so to speak. So, populist irony, is it even irony in most cases? I think it, would need a much more fine-tuned analysis in every particular in order to figure that out. But we shouldn't take it at face value. Just because they think they're being ironic and everybody calls them ironic doesn't mean they're being ironic.
Yeah, I mean, like since irony is so powerful, right? Because it holds your perspectival integrity in some way. Because you can say like I'm sincerely trying A, but I've also got the insight that B is very true, and you're holding that tension, and it can be a really valuable tension because the tension might be like right where you need to look, or like life just comes up short, right? Your ideals and what you realize are not the same, and so some irony is very humiliating. Very
I
humiliating.
just realized that I did the thing that I talked about Kierkegaard doing earlier, right? Like you people all just think you're in Christendom because you were born into Christendom. I'm actually trying to do what Christ said. I'm like, you people all think you're born into an ironic civilization where you're cynical. You're not really ironic and cynical. You got to put the work in like I'm doing.
Hipster Hamlet. That's your new nickname, Layman. Is yeah.
I'm gonna have to jump off this in about 10 minutes to get ready for our next call at the half hour.
Oh, cool. Totally. Yeah. I think I'm mostly what I've wanted to talk about. We've really brought up. I think it's some of this stuff on DC Schindler is really cool. The ideas that show up here are very much in that book. We didn't talk about freedom technically. I like the freedom to and the freedom from that John talks about sometimes, like that kind of surfaced a little bit in this. But freedom is so cool because freedom to other power or freedom to devote yourself like almost gives it like a double awesomeness when you're choosing to devote yourself in order just to have that relationship in your life. I find that just profound. Like I don't know, it's being devoted is not something John talks about a lot, but I think it's a really like almost like cheating at life to just get really sincere about something good and devote yourself to it, because then you go, oh, like it like the almost like the implicit agapic nature of reality rewards that devotion all the time. And you're like, oh wow, I gave selflessly and then was rewarded by all of this like insight and new relationships and like self-transcendence and stuff like that. So I don't know, those were some thoughts I had while I was listening to him talk about freedom in particular. Just noticed I like your shirt, Layman. Is that an armadillo? What is that creature there?
It's an aardvark.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, in honor of John. Yes, I can. What's that?
Okay.
What does that mean? Yes, I can hear you, Clem Fandango.
There's a British actor, comedian, musician named Matt Berry who's in a bunch of interesting shows. And one of the shows that he's in is called Toast of London, where he plays this washed up British actor. And it verges into surrealism all the time. But in every episode, these hipsters hire this old washed up actor to do voiceover work, and they play with him in the studio. And one of them's name is Clem Fandango, and he'll always go, this is Clem Fandango. Can you hear me, Stephen? And he'll go, yes, I can hear you, Clem Fandango. It happens in every episode. So this is a
Okay.
shout out to the 10 people who've seen that.
Excellent. We weren't obscure enough talking about Kierkegaard and Christ and Socrates. We had to add some British irony to the whole mix. If we can just bring up
That's
like
right. I got to evade you populists.
Oh goodness.
I was thinking of a book called Spacious Body by Jeffrey Maitland, who was the head of the International Rolfing Association. He's also a Zen monk, did a lot of interesting things. But the phrase that he kept using in his book, connecting Zen and Heidegger and body work, was freedom is the creative appropriation of limitation. All right, that's sort of the Ida Rolf approach to issues in the body. But there's something about that here. Like you have freedom based on the way that you take possession of your finiteness and your limitation, including the limitation that is the affect that goes with the sense of the impossible.
Tanabe describes that as kind of honorable, what you're saying there, Layman, because I was reading a lot about suffering and sorrow, because I don't know, I don't feel a lot of sorrow most of the time, and they were bringing it up a lot in episodes. So I'm like, oh, I need to relate to suffering more. I need to suffer, and why am I not feeling so much worse than I could be right now? And Tanabe kind of talks about like the admittance of other power, like makes suffering divine in a way that like just being petty, kind of like Hamlet does, makes it pedantic and arrogant. Yeah, I don't know how that ties into aardvarks or anything, but
Hamlet doesn't want any of his suffering. I don't know if you ever saw Twin Peaks, but in the Twin Peaks movie, at the end, when they go into the Black Lodge, which moves backwards in time, the Mike, who had his arm cut off and used to be paired with the demon Bob, he goes back into the Black Lodge and he says to Bob, I want all my Garmonbosia. And it's in subtitles on the screen under Garmonbosia. It says pain and suffering or pain and sorrow or something like that, right? He's undergone this transformation. He used to be with the demons, but now he wants his suffering, right? Now he's not just going to feed on the suffering others. He wants it now, and it's personal. I think that's the thing that Kierkegaard sees in Christ. It's the thing that's in Gurdjieff. It's the thing that Hamlet can't do. He's constantly moving around trying to get away from his suffering. He has no interest in it. He doesn't want to own his suffering.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, that's Jung describes that as evil too, right? Like evil is not owning your pain almost, or owning your evil, that because you always just project it back out, or you fall into some kind of disassociation with what is good in reality. And yeah. Bruce, any final thoughts? It sounds like we're kind of rounding down.
I was thinking of a few things, but I actually really like how Layman just ended it on that Twin Peaks note. I like that a lot.
Okay.
I'm very happy. We got Seinfeld. I got to do some jokes. We talked about Groucho Marx. We talked about Twin Peaks. We got Aardvarks in here. This is a very successful 90 minutes for me.
We've incorporated as much of reality as possible in as diverse a spectrum. If we talked about like albinoism, maybe Stonehenge, and I don't know, some kind of like fungal discovery, we would have the trifecta. Maybe Bill and Ted if we brought up like some good 80s references. Fantastic.